Of all the kings in the history of Israel, one king stands out above the rest. That king is David. He is described as a man after God's own heart. Well, David is not the first king, nor is he the king that had the greatest prosperity and wealth. He is the central king, central ruler of Israel. It is during his reign that the enemies of Israel are defeated. By the end of his reign, they lived in relative peace, conquered those nations that sought to destroy them. It is during his reign that Israel finally becomes, for the first time, really a true nation, and really a unified nation together. And they're established as an independent country. It is during his reign that God makes a covenant with David and a promise to him that so long as his descendants remain faithful to him, there will always be one on the throne. And so it is David that becomes a central figure, the central question that has to be asked for many in Israel when Jesus is born is, whose son is he? And they don't simply mean Joseph. They need to know, is he a son of David? Is he in that line? Because if he's not, everything else is irrelevant. To be king, he must be in that line. He is the central figure. But David's also an enigma. And even as much as he is described as a person fully after God's own heart, he's also this person who seems to screw it up big time. Is unable to manage his own household, dysfunctional in the way he raises his children, a traitor, one who uses his power for his own benefit, even to the point of murder, selfish, conceited. He's a confusing character. Toward the end of David's reign, a time when we would expect that David and really the nation, the enemies are subdued, the army's not really going out to war anymore. They're in relative peace and prosperity. It's a time when you kind of expect that everybody sort of just relishes and celebrates this king. And they know his years are getting to an end, but you've kind of reached that point. It's really perhaps silly, but if you watched any of the Jubilee stuff with Queen Elizabeth, we know there's a chaos is about to happen at some point here when she dies. But right now everybody just kind of looks upon her, and it's the end of her reign, and everybody just kind of, she could do anything, right? And nobody would care. They just celebrate her and all the years, and you kind of expect that with David, that he would just kind of get to the end of his reign and everybody would celebrate. But it's at the end of his reign that his son Absalom begins to maneuver and to work. See, there's no real clear line of succession in Israel. This is something new. David came into this role at the death of the previous king and the heirs to the throne. God places him in there. He's number one, and there's no clear pattern for this nation. There's no history or tradition about who is going to be the next one on the throne. And this ambiguity that's created because there's this lack of clarity leads an opportunity for Absalom, his son, to try to figure out a way to take the throne. And it says for 4 years, Absalom stood at the city gate, and he intercepted people that were on their way to see his father. And for 4 years, he worked and he schemed, and people, it says people would try to bow down to him. He'd lift them up, and he'd bow to them. He ingratiated the nation to himself. And people's hearts shifted, and they left his father, and they went to his. And after 4 years of this planning and strategizing and maneuvering, he blows a trumpet and declares himself king. Assembles what army he has, and he marches on Jerusalem. This is a dysfunctional family, for he intends to kill his father and to take the throne. And at a time when we would expect that David, blessed by God, would be experiencing kind of that, being able to celebrate his final years on the throne, he's fleeing. He's in sackcloth and ashes, and he's mourning and he's weeping, and they're leaving the city, and his whole entourage and the army that's still with him, and they're fleeing from the city. And he doesn't know what's going to happen. In fact, he speaks in these terms and saying, I don't know if I'm going back to Jerusalem. He doesn't know if this is the end of his reign, if this is how it's all going to end. If all of his failings, all of his pride, his selfishness, his misgivings, everything, if all of it's finally come to this climactic moment, and this is how his reign is going to end. He doesn't know if he's coming back. He doesn't know if this is a pure work of evil or if this is God's judgment on him. And he flees the city, running from his son. It's not what we would expect. It's not how we expect the reign of the central figure in the dynasty of Israel. It's not how we expect this whole story to go. Now fast forward, the end of the story, his army is successful. He returns to the city. He lives out his final days. Absalom is killed in the battle. That isn't the end of the connivings to try to get the throne, but ultimately his son Solomon comes onto the throne. But that ambiguity and that expectation of how we think life is going to be. I've shared this before. There's the church world right now, what it means to be a Christian in our country has been radically flipped on its head. Those in the church world, as they speak, they say, really, what's happened to us is, we have seen where the church was at, and so a few years ago, I went to Norway and to Germany. I'm going to change how I'm going to say this. And I had a glimpse to see in Europe what the church is going to be like 10 years from now, 10, 15 years down the road. And you sort of begin to come back from that, and you set things in motion how that's going to be. And then a pandemic hits. And crises and things happen one after the other. And what happened to the church is what everything that was we expected to be 10, 15, 20 years down the road came today. But what we know is 10 years ago. It's perhaps most like persons coming out of prison. Life doesn't change much in prison. And for an inmate that goes into prison and they're there for 20 years, it doesn't, in many prisons, 1 year is no different than 10 years. 20 years ago, we didn't have smartphones. 20 years ago, you didn't shop online. Amazon was still primarily a bookstore. Can you imagine being a person who knows how to function in 2002? And then tomorrow you've got to function in 2022? This is what inmates face. This is why there's a lot of recidivism back into prisons. This is what we are experiencing as a church. As we went from a world that we knew to a world 10 years down the road in a matter of months. It's not what we expected. And it's thrown us off. And there is a sense and a feeling that we don't know what's going on. Is God doing this to us? Or is this society doing this to us? Are we going to make it? I don't know. We don't know what God is doing to the church. And David writes. So today we're going to look at Psalm 66. For as much as David is an enigma, David is, one of the things that makes an enigma is he is, we believe to be the primary author of the book of Psalms. The book of worship within our scriptures. And he writes, and I think in Psalm 66 he teaches us how to live in the midst of times that are shifting and changing and leaving us disconnected. How to live when our expectations are not what we expect them to be. When the world around us has been destabilized. Now, I don't know if David wrote this after his experience with Absalom or any time. But it strikes me that he teaches us how to live. And he does so really in 4 scenes, 4 verses, 4 sagas, however you want to describe it. He begins the Psalm 66 by calling out to all of creation. It's a song of worship. He says, "Shout for joy to God, all the earth." David summons all of creation, all of the earth, to praise God. Psalm 8, which we looked at the last time we were in the park, and which the song that we began the service today is based on, says that all creation declares the glory of God. Without words, creation speaks the identity and who God is. It's a fun thing to ponder. It's not part of today's message, but you can ponder. What is creation saying? What does creation tell us about who God is and his character and his identity? What is it shouting out without using words? David summons all of creation together. It says, "Make praise and give glories to God." He goes on, he says, "How awesome are your deeds. So great is your power that your enemies cringe before you. All the earth bows down to you. They sing your praise. They sing praises of your name." And then after summoning all of creation to praise God, in the next scene, he invites them to come. He says he invites the congregation. He invites everyone. Come and see what God has done. What he has done for us as a nation and what he has done for the nations. He says, "Come and see his awesome deeds for humanity. He has turned the sea into dry land. They pass through the waters on foot." Now those may immediately gather images to you of the sea and the waters. If you have a different translation, instead of waters it says the rivers. And you get this sense of the passing through the Red Sea, the passing through the river of Jordan. But David's doing something even more there in those 2 words. And I had to have a commentator help me with this one. But the 2 words that he uses are not just random words to describe the sea and the rivers. The 2 words that he uses, the sea, he uses the word yam, he uses the word nahar for the rivers. Those, according to Canaanite mythology, are the gods of the sea and the rivers. And in Canaanite mythology, the god Baal, when he comes and to establish his throne in the region there where Israel is at, these are the enemy nations. When he comes, in the mythology, he gathers the thunder and the lightning and he wages war against the god of Yam and Nahar. And through thunder and lightning, he defeats them and establishes himself as the god of this land. David said, God has established himself. He is divided. And he sits God right in the middle of this land and says, he is the God of this land. He has established his throne. He has defeated the other gods. They may think Baal is some god, but he is nothing. For this is the one. Come and see what he has done. He rules forever with his power. His eyes watch. It doesn't say his eyes watch Israel. We might expect that the king would say that, but what does he say? He says his eyes watch the nations. He is not simply God of Israel. He's not simply God of this piece of dirt, this land that is our inheritance. He is God of the nations. And he governs and he rules all nations. He goes on the third phrase. He says, praise our God, all peoples. Let the sound of his praise be heard. And there's a turn that perhaps is unexpected in this. Because he says, for he has preserved our lives and kept our feet from slipping. For you, God, tested us. You refined us like silver. You brought us into prison and laid burdens on our backs. You let people ride over our heads. We went through fire and water, but you brought us to a place of abundance. And we are reminded that the way of the people of God, the way of the presence of God, is in the midst of suffering. Yahweh, the God of Israel, is unlike any other God. And that he exists and he is present in the midst of suffering. In the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, 3 men are thrown into a fiery furnace. And where is God? He is the 4th. Part of what is so stunning about that story is that God is not outside the furnace. Is that God is in the furnace. In the place of suffering. And even more stunning is who calls them out. It's not God that calls them to come to leave the furnace. It's the king who says, come out. And you're left to wonder, if he had never said anything, would the 4 of them forever remained in there? God is the God who is in the midst, in the presence of our suffering. David, many times, his life was threatened. Many times he had to flee. At one point, he even had to flee into the land of the Philistines, pretend that he was mad, had lost his mind, because his life was in danger. Driven away. And yet he praises God, and yet he summons all of creation. Yet he calls the congregation together to come and see what God has done. And it says while he is in this time, while he has been in prison, they made vows to God. And they come from that declaring with thankfulness to what God has done. And they declare God's goodness. He sacrifices those prayers. Then finally he says, come and hear, all you who fear God. Let me tell you what God has done for me. In the final stanza, David turns and he takes that which is general, that which he speaks about the nations, that which he speaks about the nation of Israel, and he turns and he says, let me tell you not just what God has been doing, but let me tell you what he's done for me. He makes it personal. And the climactic thing that David says God did for him, he says, God has listened and heard my prayer. In verse 19. God has listened. He has heard my prayer. This is good news. It's not good advice. Do you know the difference between good news and good advice? Nobody likes good advice. Nobody wants good advice, no matter how good it is. If you go to your doctor's office and they tell you, they look at all your charts, your numbers, and they say you need to lose some weight, you need to eat less and exercise more. What do? You immediately leave. You go to a restaurant. You order food to console yourself, and then you go on Yelp and you write a review of your doctor on how inconsiderate he is. Nobody likes good advice. But what happens, like what happened to me this week, when you meet with a friend you haven't seen for a few years, and you meet with him and you realize he has lost over 70 pounds in the last year. What do? You ask, what did you do? Well, eat less, exercise more. It's the same advice, same. One's good news. So what do you do then? You go out and you sign up for a gym membership, don't you? Good news versus good advice. It's the difference in what David is speaking about. He does not share simply good advice. Trust me, if you pray, God will hear your prayers. He says, God heard my prayers. He shares good news. In the midst of times that are confusing, that are uncertain, shifts and changes, in the midst of experiences that are unexpected, And things don't happen the way we expect they should. And this isn't the pattern. This isn't the narrative that I thought for our life. This isn't the narrative that I thought for our church. David invites us to pray, to praise. He invites us to remember. See, one of the core identities of the people of God is they remember. God is not simply Yahweh. He is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And there is this call to remember that He is unique and personal. That He has chosen a people. When Stephen is stoned in Acts chapter 7, he's stoned partly because he calls the people to remember. He begins his speech before they stone him by calling them to recount their history and pointing out that their history points to Jesus. And they don't want to remember who they are. And for that, they stone him. And when Jesus comes to his disciples and he gives them this table of bread and wine, he says, what? Do this in remembrance of me. Continually remember what I have done for you as a people and what I have done for you. And to declare the good news, not simply good advice, that God has listened and He has heard my prayer. I wonder what your story is. If you were to look back, not simply this last week, 10, 20, 30 years in your life, what would you say? What do you remember? How has God listened and heard your prayer? How has He demonstrated His power to the nations? Parted rivers. And even been with you through prison, through suffering. Now, I've not planted or seeded this at all, so we're going to see how this goes. But I'm going to ask, is there one or two who could actually tell us, who'd be willing to share and call us to remember what God has done? Does anybody have a story they'd want to share? You look back and you see this is the good news of what God has done. One of the commentators I read said this. He says, testimony is the language that seeks with honesty and humility to allow another to hear and perhaps even experience what we have experienced or known in God. Is there anyone who invites us, who's willing to share with us that we might experience with you what you experienced from God?